Oh, good day. Good day and gratitude. Good day and gratitude. Well, I guess that means we can go right on ahead and start reading. I forgot if sister was saying to get, was she saying to get a copper cup? I absolutely forgot, but I went and got me some little cups today. Ooh, that's different. Yeah, I don't know about that. Let's try that another time. I'll just stick with this one for now. It is cute though. But let's go ahead and read Copyright Disclaimer 107 of the Copyright Act 1976. Allowance is made for fair use for purposes such as criticism, comment, news support, teaching, scholarship, and research. Fair uses are used permitted by copyright statute that might otherwise be infringing. Non-profit, educational, or personal use tips the balance in favor of fair use. Let me turn on my air. You feel the one that gets it. And I hope everyone had a wonderful day today. And it was the 8-8 portal today. It didn't escape my notice once I heard sister and I heard a brother mentioning it too. Stamped from the beginning. That's what we're reading now. We're going to try to read 4 chapters. Yeah, we're going to try to read 4 chapters. Saving souls, not bodies. Is that where we were at? Yep. Ooh, because chapter 5 is Black Hunts. This is a really worthy read. I can tell that already. Then Black Exhibits. Yeah, let's read. Saving souls, not bodies. And this is a stamp from the beginning, the definitive history of racist ideas in America by Ibram X. Kendi. Oh, good day, Cow Dog. It's so good to see you. It is so good to see you, my brother. I know I still got those documentaries to look at too. I'll get to them. Yes, I sure will. And brother, we decided to read Stamp from the beginning to get a little bit more thorough and in depth on these racist ideas and racist monopolies and this racist system that we exist in. When Charles II restored the English throne in 1660, he restored the religious persecution of Puritans. Roughly 2,000 Puritan ministers were forced out of the Church of England during the Great Ejection. In New England, Richard Mather had lost some hearing and sight in one eye, but he was still as defiant to the crown as he had been as a younger man, and he steered New England nonconformists as adroitly, Adroitly, and he steered New England nonconformists as adroitly as he had done for 3 decades. His fellow theological captain, John Cotton, had died in 1652. Mather's first wife had also died, and he had married Cotton's widow, Sarah Hankridge Story Cotton. His youngest son, Increase Mather married Sarah's daughter, now his stepsister, Maria Cotton, further interlacing the ties between the famous Cottons and Mathers. As if to triple knot the family tie, Increase and Maria named their first son upon his birth on February 12, 1663, Cotton Mather. Oh, well. Richard Mather lived 6 years after the birth of his grandson. When he died, Increase Mather honored his father by writing his biography, putting in print Richard Mather's providential deliverance from the Great Hurricane of 1635, a story as meaningful to the Mather lineage as any passage in the Bible. Increase Mather, who took the helm of John Cotton's famed North Church of Boston in 1662, taught all 10 of his eventual children that they were regular receivers of divine providence like their grandfather. Increase especially expressed his exceptionality to Cotton Mather. In time, Cotton would make his father a prophet. He combined the best of the Cottons and the Mathers, eclipsing them all in America's historical memory. By the century's end, African slavery sounded as natural to the colonists as the name Cotton Mather, and hardly any intellectual was more responsible for this binding than Cotton Mather himself. Cotton Mather was not the sole progenitor, Progenitor. Cotton Mather was not the sole progenitor of such ideas, however. He was influenced by the books he read by his contemporaries, and few, if any, books influenced Cotton Mather's racist ideas more than Richard Baxter's A Christian Directory. From his British ministerial post in Kidderminster, Kidderminster, Richard Baxter urged slaveholders across the ocean to follow God's law in making slaves into Christians in his well-traveled treatise of Christian Directory. That's from 1664 to 1665. He told them to make it your chief end in buying and using slaves, to win them to Christ and save their souls. Be sure to let their salvation be far more valued by you than their service. Although he was at the head of the missionary movement, Baxter was not alone in proselytizing. 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 Baxter was not alone in proselytizing to African people. As early as 1657, English dissenter George Fox prevailed on his newly rounded religious society of Friends, or Quakers, to convert the enslaved, eschewing eschewing church hierarchies and preaching that everyone had access to the inward light of God. The Quakers seemed primed to one day produce abolitionists and anti-racists. In an effort to square his Christian faith, or his nation's Christian faith, with slavery, Baxter tried to argue that some of benevolent slavery was possible, and it would be helpful for African people. These assimilationist ideas of Christianizing and civilizing enslaved Africans were particularly dangerous because they gave convincing power to the idea that slavery was just and it should not be resisted. And so Baxter, a non-conforming Puritan, conformed his Puritan readers to most, though certainly not all, of the racist policies of Charles II's expanding slaveholding empire. People who have forfeited life or liberty can be enslaved, Baxter wrote. However, to go as pirates and catch up poor Negroes is one of the worst kind of thievery in the world. Enslavers that buy them and use them as beasts and neglect their souls are fitter to be called incarnate devils than Christians. Baxter naively believed there existed in bulk in the slave trade what he called a voluntary slave. Baxter naively believed there existed in bulk in the slave trade what he called a voluntary slave. He tried to will into existence a world where loving masters bought voluntary slaves to save their souls. Baxter's world remained a heavenly dream crafted long ago by Gomez Ines de Zurara. Remember Zurara? And even that dream world was seen as a threat by enslavers. American enslavers were still afraid to baptize Africans because Christian slaves like Elizabeth Key could sue for their freedom. The colonies moved quickly to legalize the proselytizing demands of missionaries like Richard Baxter and to hush the freedom cries from Christian slaves. In 1667, Virginia decreed that the conferring of baptism does not alter the condition of the person as to his bondage. Damn. In 1667, in other words, just because you get baptized does not mean that's going to change your condition as far as being enslaved. New York did the same thing in 1664, as did Maryland in 1671. May Moore, masters and Virginia legislators and scribes, carefully endeavored the propagation of Christianity to slaves. Masters were supposed to care for the resisting souls of their captives. But what about their resisting bodies? In 1667, the English Parliament empowered masters to control the wild, barbarous, and savage nature of enslaved Africans only with strict severity. And in 1669, the personal physician of Lord Anthony Ashley Cooper, one of the Lords Proprietor of the Province of Carolina, in his draft of the original fundamental Constitution of the Carolinas, awarded the founding planters of the province absolute power and authority over all of their captives. When John Locke moved to London in 1667 to become the personal physician of Lord Cooper, he had much more to offer the colonizing British politician than his medical expertise. He had studied at the feet of Robert Boyle after his educational tenure at Oxford, and he had ended up collecting more travel books than philosophy texts for his immense personal library. Lord Cooper asked Locke to draw up the Carolinas Constitution and serve as the secretary of the proprietors and soon the Council of Trade and Plantations and the Board of Trade and Plantations. Not many Englishmen were more knowledgeable or less compassionate than Locke about British colonialism and slavery. You should feel nothing at all of others' misfortune. That's what Locke advised a friend of his in 1670. You should feel nothing at all of others' misfortune. Between all his colonial and medical duties, by July 1671, Locke had written his first draft of his lasting philosophical monument, an essay concerning humane understanding. Over the next 2 decades, he revised and expanded the essay before its grand appearance in 4 books in 1689. That same year, Locke also released his 2 treatises of government, attacking monarchy, requesting a government with the consent of the governed, and distinguishing between temporary servants and slaves who, being captives taken in a just war, are by the right of nature subjected to the absolute dominion and arbitrary power of their masters. Oh. Are by the right of subjected to the absolute. In any society, the mind at first is rasa tubula. It's rasa tabula, R-A-S-A, rasa tabula, T-A-B-U-L-A. Locke famously wrote in an essay concerning humane understanding. If people are born without innate intelligence, then there cannot be a natural intellectual hierarchy. If people are born without innate intelligence, then there cannot be a natural intellectual hierarchy. But Locke's egalitarian idea had a caveat. As Boyle and Newton painted unblemished white light, Locke more or less painted the unblemished mind white. Locke used the term white paper much more often than blank slate or tabula rasa to describe the child as yet unprejudiced understanding. Locke also touched on the origin of species in an essay concerning humane understanding. Apes, whether these be all men or no, all of the human species, depended on one's definition of the word man, because he said, if history not lie, then West African women had conceived babies with apes. Locke thus reinforced African female hypersexuality in a passage sent around the English-speaking world. And what real species, by that measure, such a production would be in nature, would be a new question. Locke's new question reflected another new racist debate that most debaters feared to engage in publicly. Assimilationists argued monogenesis, that all humans were one species descended from a single human creation in Europe's Garden of Eden. How got Garden of Eden in Europe? That all humans were one species descended from a single human creation in Europe's Garden of Eden. That's the first time I ever heard of that. But let's read. So they always had this mentality, it seems. We're finna find out. Segregationists argued polygenesis, that there were multiple origins of multiple human species. Ever since Europeans had laid eyes on Native Americans in 1492, a people unmentioned in the Bible, they had started questioning the biblical creation story. Some speculated that Native Americans had to have descended from a different Adam. By the end of the 16th century, European thinkers had added African people to the list of species descended from a different Adam. So how it come to be that this Adam and Eve is the one now? In 1616, Italian freethinker Lucilio Vanini, Lucilio Vanini said, as Locke suggested later, that Ethiopians and apes must have the same ancestry, distinct from Europeans. But no one made the case for polygenesis as stoutly as French theologian Isaac Lapierre and Pra-Adamite. Yeah, that's Isaac, L-A, Isaac Lapierre, P-E-Y-R-E-R-E, and Pra-Adamite, P-R-A-E-A-D-A-M-I-T-A-E, Pra-Adamite, Adamite, I guess the A silent. Pra-Adamite in 1655. Translated in English in 1656, men before Adam was publicly burned in Paris and banned from Europe after Locke had secured a copy, of course. Christians tossed Lapierre in prison and burned Vanini at the stake for defying the Christian monogenesis story of Adam and Eve, but they could not stop the drift of polygenesis. To justify black enslavement, Barbados planters actually preferred the polygenesis theory over the curse theory of Ham, according to eyewitness Morgan Godwin. Godwin made this revelation in a 1680 pamphlet that criticized racist planters for making those two words, Negro and slave, synonymous, while white was the general name for Europeans. This Anglican brought his missionary zeal from Virginia to Barbados in the 1670s. He stood at the forefront of his denomination's efforts to baptize enslaved Africans, aping a Quaker named William Edmondson. In 1675, a war more destructive than the Great Hurricane of 1635 ravaged New England. 3,000 Native Americans and 600 settlers were killed, and numerous towns and burgeoning economies were destroyed during King Philip's War. In the midst of the carnage, William Edmondson, who had founded Quakerism in Ireland, arrived in Rhode Island, reeling from his failure to convert enslaved Africans in Barbados. When his failures continued in Rhode Island, he began to understand that slavery was holding back his missions. And he told slave-owning Quakers as much in a letter in 1676. Edmondson had an assimilationist vision, a vision to restrain and reclaim African people from their accustomed, filthy, unclean practices in defiling each other. Quakers' self-denial of human property could be known to all. Abolitionist ideas blossomed again a dozen years later among the Mennonite and the Quaker founders of Germantown and Philadelphia, this time without Edmondson's assimilationist ideas. Mennonites were an Anabaptist denomination born out of the Protestant Reformation in the German and Dutch-speaking areas of Central Europe. During the 16th and early 17th centuries, Orthodox authorities legally persecuted the Mennonites. The Mennonites did not intend to leave behind one site of oppression to build another site in America. Mennonites therefore circulated an anti-slavery petition on April 18, 1688. There is a saying that we shall do to all men like as we will be done ourselves, making no difference of what generation, descent, or color they are. C-O-L-O-U-R, the spelling is of them times. In Europe, there are many oppressed for their religion, and here those are oppressed for their black color. Both oppressions are wrong. Both oppressions were wrong. Actually, as an oppressor, America surpassed Holland and Germany. Africans had the right to fight for their freedom. The 1688 Germantown petition against slavery was the inaugural anti-racist tract among European settlers in colonial America. Beginning with this piece, the golden rule will forever inspire the cause of white anti-racists of all races, whether out of altruism or intelligent self-interest, would always recognize that preserving racial hierarchies simultaneously preserves ethnic, gender, class, sexual, age, and religious hierarchies. Human hierarchies of any kind, they understood, would do little more than oppress all of humanity. But powerful slaveholding Philadelphia Quakers killed the Germantown petition out of economic self-interest. William Edmondson had likewise suffered for promoting anti-slavery arguments a dozen years earlier. Slaveholding Quakers across New England had banished Edmondson from their meetings. The elderly founder of the American Baptist Church, Rhode Island's Roger Williams, called Edmondson nothing but a bundle of ignorance. Not many New Englanders read Edmondson's letter to slaveholding Quakers, and not many noticed its significance. Everyone was focused on King Philip's War. In early August 1676, Increase Mather, the theological scion of New England with his father dead, implored God from sunup to sundown to cut down King Philip or Metacomet, the Native American war leader. The conflict had been worsening for a little over a year, and the Puritans had lost homes and dozens of their soldiers. Less than a week after Mather's prayer campaign, Metacomet was killed, more or less ending the war. Puritans cut up his body as if it were hogs. A nearly 14-year-old Cotton Mather detached Metacomet's jaw from his skull. Puritans then paraded Metacomet's remains around Plymouth. Down in Virginia, Governor George Berkeley was trying to avoid a totally different war with neighboring Native Americans, in part to avoid disrupting his profitable fur trade. 29-year-old frontier planter Nathaniel Bacon had other plans, though. The racial laws passed in the 1660s had done little to diminish class conflict. Around April 1676, Bacon mobilized a force of frontier white laborers to redirect their anger from elite whites to Susquehannocks, Susquehannocs. Yes, around April 1676, Bacon mobilized a force of frontier white laborers to redirect their anger from elite whites to Susquehannocks. Bacon's mind game worked. Since my being with the volunteers, the discourse and earnestness of the people is against the Indians, Bacon wrote to Berkeley in triumph. Berkeley charged Bacon with treason, more worried about armed landless whites, the rabble crew, than the Susquehannocks and nearby Occaneechees, Occaneechees, Occaneechees. But Bacon was not so easily stopped. By some, of the frontier war had quickly become a civil war, or to some, a class war, with Bacon and his supporters rebelling against Berkeley, and Berkeley hiring a militia of mercenaries. By September 1676, a defiant Bacon had proclaimed liberty. A defiant Bacon had proclaimed liberty to all servants and all Negroes. For Governor Berkeley's wealthy white inner circle, poor whites and enslaved blacks joining hands presaged the apocalypse. At the head of 500 men, Bacon burned down Jamestown, forcing Berkeley to flee. When Bacon died of dysentery in October, the rebellion was doomed. Luring whites with pardons and blacks with liberty, Berkeley's forces persuaded most of Bacon's army to lay down their weapons. They spent the next few years crushing the rest of the rebels. Rich planters learned from Bacon's rebellion that poor white people had to be forever separated from enslaved blacks. They divided and conquered by creating more white privileges. In 1680, legislators pardoned only the white rebels. They prescribed 30 lashes for any slave who lifted a hand against any Christian. Christian now meant white. All whites now wielded absolute power to abuse any African person. By the early 18th century, every Virginia county had a militia of landless whites ready in case any sudden eruption of Indians or insurrection of Negroes. Poor white people had risen into their lowly place in slave society, the armed defenders of planters, a place that was so bitter animosity between them and enslaved Africans. Cotton Mather was in college when he detached Metacomic's jaw from his skull and heard about Bacon's rebellion. Back in the summer of 1674, Increased Mather crossed the Charles River to present an 11-year-old Cotton Mather for admission as the youngest student in Harvard's history. He was already well known in New England as an intellectual prodigy, or from the Puritan standpoint, the chosen one. Cotton Mather was fluent in Latin, running through 15 chapters of the Bible a day, and as pious as boys come. Smaller than a sixth grade pupil, when Cotton Mather walked onto the tiny campus, he was like a self-righteous politician entering a corrupted Congress. The dozen or so 15 to 18-year-olds schemed to break the 11-year-old's moral backbone until Increased Mather complained about the hazing. The teenager stopped prodding him to sin, but sin still bedeviled him. Sin was like the shadow he could never shake. The most trivial incident could explode into anxiety. The most trivial incident could explode into anxiety. One day his tooth ached. Have I not sinned with my teeth? His mind raced. How? By sinful, graceless, excessive eating, and by evil speeches. Cotton Mather had started stuttering, and the incessant self-searching and the burden of trying to live up to his two famous names may have worsened his condition. For the young minister in training, the soul-searching setback caused him to turn to his ink and quill. Insecure in speech, Cotton Mather seemed to be a different person as a writer. Confident, he was brilliant and artistic. His father allowed him to write up many important church and government documents. Cotton ended up writing 7,000 pages of sermons in his notebooks between the ages of 13 and 32, far and away more sermonic pages than any other American Puritan. And his diary from 1681 to 1725 is the lengthiest available of any American Puritan. Cotton Mather had been encouraged by his anxious but reassuring father. Sooner or later, Cotton steeled his determination to find a way around the mighty rock. The youngster incessantly practiced away his stammer by singing songs and speaking slowly. And by the end of his Harvard days, he had learned to control it. He was delivered. Cotton Mather cruised to the annual Boston Commencement Day in 1678. Harvard President Uriah Oakes called him to receive his degree. What a name! Oakes smiled. I made a mistake, I confess. I should have said, what names? The 15-year-old Cotton Mather graduated into a British world that was developing more and more sophisticated racist ideas to rationalize African slavery. English scientists and colonizers seemed to be trading theories. Around 1677, Royal Society economist William Petty drafted a hierarchy scale of humanity, locating the Guinea Negroes at the bottom. Middle Europeans, he wrote, differed from Africans in their natural manners and in the internal qualities of their minds. In 1679, the British Board of Trade approved Barbados' brutality. The British Board of Trade approved Barbados' brutally racist slave codes, which was securing the investments of traders and planters, and then produced a racist idea to justify the approval. Africans were a brutish sort of people. In 1683, Increase and Cotton Mather founded colonial America's first formal intellectual group, the Boston Philosophical Society. Modeled after London's Royal Society, the Boston Society lasted only 4 years. The Mathers never published a journal, but if they had, they might have modeled it after the Royal Society's Philosophical Transactions or the Journal des Sçavans in Paris. These were the organs of Western Europe's scientific revolution, and new ideas on race were a part of that revolution. French physician and travel writer Francois Bernier, a friend of John Locke's, anonymously crafted a new division of the earth in the French journal in 1684. Through his essay, Bernier became the first popular classifier of all humans into races, which he differentiated fundamentally by their phenotypic characteristics. To Bernier, Berneier, there existed 4 or 5 species or races of men so notably differing from each other that this may serve as the just foundation of a new division in the world. Wow. As a monogenesis, monogenesis, he held that all men are descended from one individual. He distinguished 4 races. The first race, which included Europeans, were the original humans. Then there were the Africans, the East Asians, and the quite frightful people of northern Finland, the Lapps. Bernier gave future taxonomists some revisionist work to do when he lumped with Europeans in the first race of the people of North Africa, the Middle East, India, the Americas, and Southeast Asia. The notion of Europeans, save the Lapps, as being in the first race was part of the Western thought almost from the beginning of racist ideas. It sat in the conceptual core of climate theory. Africans darkened by the sun could return to their original white complexion by living in cooler Europe. In advancing white originality and normality, Bernier positioned the first race as the yardstick against which the others are measured, as historian Siep Sturman later explained. That's Siep Sturman. Siep Sturman. Bernier simultaneously viewed and normalized, screened and standardized white people, and he eroticized African women. Those cherry red lips, those ivory teeth, those large lively eyes, that bosom and the rest, Bernier marveled. I dare say there is no more delightful spectacle in the whole world. It was a subtle contradiction, the diminution of black people's total as racial humanity in the midst of the elevation of their sexual humanity, a contradiction inherent in much of anti-black racism. Bernier valued rationality, using it as a yardstick of superiority, irrespective of physicality. Superior physicality related Africans to those creatures containing the utmost physical prowess, animals. Francois Bernier posed the notion of two human souls, one hereditary, sensitive, non-rational, and animal-like, the other one God-given, spiritual, and rational. Those who excel in the powers of the mind should command those who only excel in brute force, Bernier concluded, just as the soul governs the body and man rules animals. Oh, honey, yeah, they fool themselves so damn good. Oh, they should, yes. Oh, my ancestors. Ooh, that's what this book finna be about. It is unclear whether Cotton Mather read Bernier's new division of the earth. Next to his father, he was more likely than any other English-speaking New Englander to know a little French and read the Journal des Scavences. In the year after his graduation, he amassed one of the largest libraries in New England. But the late 1670s and 1680s were a tense time for New England elites. It was difficult to maintain the peace of mind for leisurely reading. In 1676, English colonial administrator Edward Randolph had journeyed to New England, and he had seen the devastation wrought by King Philip's War. Randolph, an advocate of stern royal control, informed King Charles II of New England's vulnerability and suggested that the time had come to snatch the royally appointed chair of autonomy from Massachusetts, the precious charter of 1629, out of colonial hands. In the coming years, while Cotton Mather finished college and prepared for the pulpit, Randolph journeyed back and forth over the Atlantic Ocean. Every trip stirred new rumors of the charter being pulled and a new round of debates on whether to submit, compromise, or defy the king. Some New Englanders were furious at the prospect of losing local rule. God forbid that I should give away the inheritance of my fathers, stormed increased Mather at the town meeting in January 1684. Yeah, and he said, God forbid that I should give away the inheritance of my fathers. A year after Cotton Mather became co-pastor with his father of Boston's North Church, Randolph returned holding the royal revocation of the charter and the installation of a royal governor, Sir Edmund Andros, Andros. Much of New England despondently submitted on May 14, 1686. Not increased Mather, the newly installed head of Harvard. By May 1688, he was in England lobbying the successor to Charles II, James II, who offered religious liberty to Catholics and nonconformists. But during the Glorious Revolution later in the year, James II was overthrown by William, the Dutch prince, and James's daughter Mary. New Englanders did not sit by idly, though. In 1689, they raised the baton of revolt. Ooh, wait, honey, we made it to chapter 5. I know, I'm just like, who is all of these people? Yeah, now I don't know about you, but I know for me is if I was reading this, I would be writing everybody's name down. I would have a notebook because it's hard to keep up with these characters. But maybe as we go along and stuff, I can put everybody into their perspective spots. But it's okay with me that everybody racist as fuck at this point. So yeah. Layla, is that you? Layla, it's so good to see you. And Sensei, hi, it's so good to see y'all. I just wanted to come on and read because you know I said I'm going to try to be on every night so we can read and get this book done and get some understanding and stuff. And yeah, it'll help me process things, a whole lot of stuff. And look at the back right here. Remember that book we was talking about, that documentary, that 1,408-page document on genocide, American Dilemma? It's in here too. It's on chapter 28. Ooh, that's quite a ways to go. We're going to make it there though. It's on chapter 28, Freedom Brand. However, Birth of a Nation. You know, I said we're going to watch Birth of a Nation. I want to see Birth of a Nation and Klansmen too. Birth of a Nation is on chapter 25. Yeah. Ooh, Black Hunts. On the evening of April 17, 1689, the 26-year-old Cotton Mather probably held a meeting at his house. These elite merchants and ministers plotted to seize the captain of the royal warship guarding Boston Harbor, arrest the royalists, and compel the surrender of royalist contingent on Fort Hill. They hoped to control and contain the revolt, avoid the bloodshed, and await instructions from England, where increased Mather held his lobbying post before William and Mary. They didn't want a revolution. They merely wanted their royally backed local power reestablished. But if the country people, by any unrestrainable violences, pushed towards revolution, Cotton Mather explained, then to pacify the ungovernable, they would present a declaration of gentlemen and merchants. The next morning, conspirators seized the warship captain as planned. News of the seizure initiated rebellious seizures all over Boston, as the elite plotters feared would occur. A revulsed working class crowd gathered at the townhouse in the center of town, driving and furious, avid the royal blood and independence. Mather rushed to the townhouse. At noon, he probably read from the gallery a declaration of gentlemen and merchants to the revolutionaries. Mather's calm, assuring, ministerial voice reasoned down the passions of the populace, according to family lore. By nightfall, Sir Edmund Andros, Edward Randolph, and other known royalists had been arrested, and Puritan merchants and preachers once again ruled New England. The populace remained unruly, however. Over the next few weeks, Cotton Mather was tapped to preach at a May convention called to settle the various demands for independence, military rule, or the old charter. He didn't see democracy in the different demands. He saw pandemonium. I'm old enough to cry peace, and in the name of God, I do it, he preached at the convention. The next day, town representatives voted to return to the old charter and reappoint the old governor, Simon Bradstreet. Peace, or the old social order of the populace submitting to the ministers and merchants, did not reappear as Mather had wished. Nearly everyone knew the Bradstreet government was unofficial, as it had not received royal backing. When the king recalled Andros, Randolph, and other royalists in July 1689, it did not calm the masses. All confusion is here, one New Englander reported. Every man is a governor, another man testified. The Declaration of Gentlemen and Merchants, most likely written by Mather, resembled another declaration by another prominent intellectual down in Virginia a century later. In the 6th article of 12, the writer declared, the people of New England were all slaves, and the only difference between them and slaves is their not being bought and sold. In unifying New Englanders, Mather tried to redirect the resistance of commoners from local elites to British masters. And in actuality, Mather saw more differences between Puritans and slaves. If his other published words in 1689 were any indication than between local Englanders and their British masters. In the collection of sermons, Small offers toward the service of the tabernacle in the wilderness. Damn. Small offers toward the service of the tabernacle in the wilderness. Mather first shared his racial views, calling the Puritan colonists the English Israel, a chosen people. Puritans must religiously instruct all slaves and children, the inferiors, Mather pleaded. But masters were not doing their job of looking after African souls, which were as white and good as those of other nations, but are destroyed for lack of knowledge. Now, ain't we done heard that before? Cotton Mather had built on Richard Baxter's theological race concept. The souls of African people were equal to those of the Puritans. They were white. Well, they were white and good. That's what they said. They were white and good. Oh, wait. Mather wrote all humans having an unblemished white soul the same year John Locke declared all unblemished minds to be white. Robert Boyle and Isaac Newton had already popularized light as white. Michelangelo had already painted the original Adam and God as both being white in the Vatican's Sistine Chapel. And for all these white men, whiteness symbolized beauty, a trope taken up by one of the first popular novels by an English woman. Published in 1688, Afra Bean's Orinoco, or The Royal Slave, was the first English novel to repeatedly use terms like white men, white people, and Negro. And that's Afra Bean's, Aprabehen, Afra Bean. And the book was The Royal Slave, or it's got the original title, Orinoco, or The Royal Slave. And it's a novel. Set in the Dutch South American colony of Suriname, Orinoco is the story of the enslavement and resistance of a young English woman and her husband, Orinoco, an African prince. Orinoco's beautiful, agreeable, and handsome. Physical features looked more European than African. His nose was rising and Roman instead of African and flat, and his behavior was more civilized, according to the European mode, than any other had been. Ben framed Orinoco as a heroic, noble savage, superior to Europeans in his ignorance, in his innocence, in his harmlessness, and in his capacity for learning from Europeans. And in true assimilationist fashion, one of the characters insisted, a Negro can change color, for I have seen him as frequently blush and look pale, and that as visibly as I ever saw in the most beautiful white. Richard Baxter endorsed the London edition of Cotton Mather's other 1689 publication, his first book-length work, which became a bestseller, Memorable Providences, relating to witchcraft and possessions. Baxter rejoiced, having influenced the young Mather as someone likely to prove so great a master building in the Lord's work. Okay. Mather's treatise outlining the symptoms of witchcraft reflected his crusade against the enemies of white souls. He could not stop preaching about the existence of the devil and witches, or perhaps the restlessness of the commoners in the aftermath of the 1689 revolt triggered the real obsession in Cotton Mather. The revolt, indeed, had fueled public strife against not only the faraway British king, but also Puritan rulers of Mather's stature. Maybe Mather was consciously attempting to redirect the public's anger away from elites and toward invisible demons. He did regularly preach that anyone and anything that criticized his English Israel must be led by the devil. Long before egalitarian rebels in America started to be cast off as extremists, criminals, radicals, outsiders, communists, or terrorists, Mather's community of ministers ostracized egalitarian rebels as devils and witches. How many doleful wretches have been decoyed into witchcraft? Cotton Mather asked in 1691. His father, Increase Mather, preached a lengthy series on devils in 1693 after returning from England with the new Masses Charter. Samuel Parris, Parris, a Salem minister, preached endlessly about the devils in their midst. And on one dismal day in February 1692, Parris anxiously watched his 9-year-old daughter and his 11-year-old niece suffer chokes, convulsions, and pinches. As their condition worsened each day, the ministers worsened too. It dawned on Parris the girls had been bewitched. While prayers rose up like kites in Salem and nearby towns, the Salem witch hunt began. The number of afflicted and accused spread over the next few months, swelling the public uproar and turning public attention from political to religious strife. And in nearly every instance, the devil who was preying upon innocent white Puritans was described as black. One Puritan accuser described the devil as a little black bearded man. Another saw a black thing of a considerable bigness. A black thing jumped in one man's window. The body was like that of a monkey, the observer added. The feet like a cock's, but the face much like a man's. Since the devil represented criminality, and since criminals in New England were said to be the devil's operatives, the Salem witch hunt ascribed a black face to criminality, an ascription that remains to this very day. Now, Cotton Mather's friends were appointed judges, including merchant John Richards, who had just officiated at Mather's wedding. In a letter to Richards on May 31st, 1692, Mather expressed his support for capital punishment. The Richards court executed Bridget Bishop on June 10th, the first of more than 20 accused witches to die. Bridget Bishop. Miss Bridget. The accused up north in Andover, Massachusetts, confessed that the black devil compelled them to renounce their baptism and sign his book. They wrote polls to meetings where as many as 500 witches plotted to destroy New England. The accused confessed. Hearing about this, Cotton Mather sniffed out a hellish design of bewitching and ruin our land. Yes, he said he smelled a hellish design of bewitching and ruining our land. Mather ventured to Salem for the first time to witness the executions on August the 19th, 1692. He came to see the killing of George Burroughs, the supposed general of the Black Devil's New England army of witches. Burroughs preached Anabaptist ideas of religious equality on the northern frontier, the kind of ideas that had bred anti-racism in Germantown. Mather watched Burroughs plead his innocence at the execution site and stir the very great number of spectators when he recited the Lord's Prayer, something the judges said witches could not do, but he did. The black man stood and dictated to him. Burroughs' accuser shouted. The black man stood and dictated to him, Burroughs' accuser shouted, trying and failing to calm the crowd. Mather heard the ticking time bomb of the spectators, sounding like the unruly mass during the 1689 revolt. As soon as Burroughs was hanged, Mather sought to quell the passions of the crowd by reinscribing the executive policies of his ruling class into God's law. Remember, he preached, the devil often transformed himself into an angel of light. Mather clearly believed in the power of religious and racial transformation, from black devils to white angels, with good or bad intentions. Yeah, well, that would be today. Yeah, you're a white angel when you pass away and you go to heaven. Yeah, and everybody know that's how we see it. This is why we see things like we see things. The furor over witches soon died down, but even after Massachusetts authorities apologized, reversed the convictions, and provided reparations in the early 1700s, honey, Mather never stopped defending the Salem witch trials because he never stopped defending the religious, class, slaveholding, gender, and racial hierarchies reinforced by the trials. These hierarchies benefited elites like him, or as he continued to preach, they were in accord with the law of God. And Cotton Mather viewed himself or presented himself as the defender of God's law, the crucifier of any non-Puritan, African, Native American, poor person, or woman who defied God's law by not following the rules of submission. Sometime after the witch trials, maybe to save their black faces from accusations of devilishness and criminality, a group of enslaved Africans formed a religious society of Negroes in Boston. Religious Society of Negroes in Boston. It was one of the first known organizations of African people in colonial America. Yep, one of the first known organizations of African people in colonial America. In 1693, Cotton Mather drew up the society's list of rules, prefaced by a covenant. We, the miserable children of Adam and Noah, freely resolve to become the servants of that glorious Lord. Two of Mather's rules were instructive. Members were to be counseled by someone wise and of English descent, and they were not to afford any shelter to anyone who had run away from their masters. Meeting weekly, some members of the society probably delighted in hearing Mather cast their souls as white. Some probably rejected these racist ideas and used the society to mobilize against enslavement. The religious societies of Negroes did not last. Few Africans wanted to be Christians at that time, though that would change in a few decades. And not many masters were willing to let their captives become Christians because, unlike in other colonies, there was no Massachusetts law stipulating that baptized slaves did not have to be freed. Throughout the social tumult of the 1690s, Mather obsessed over maintaining the social hierarchies by convincing the lowly that God and nature had put them there, whether it applied to women, children, enslaved Africans, or poor people. In a good master well served, 1696, he presumed that nature had created a conjugal society between husband and wife, a parental society between parent and child, and lowest of all, a herile society, Herile, a herile society between master and servant. Society, he said, became destabilized when children, women, and servants refused to accept their station. Mather compared egalitarian registers to that old ambitious devil who wanted to become the all-powerful God. This line of thinking became Mather's everlasting justification of social hierarchy. The ambitious lowly resembled Satan. His kind of elites resembled God. So that was his thinking. The ambitious lowly people resemble Satan, and his kind of elites resemble God. You are better fed and better clothed and better managed by far than you would be if you were your own men. Mather informed enslaved Africans in A Good Master Well Served. His insistence that urbane American slavery was better than barbaric African freedom was not unlike Gomez Eanes de Zuraura's estimation that Africans were better off as slaves in Portugal than they had been in Africa. Do not partake in evil, and make yourself infinitely blacker than you already are. Mather warned. By obeying, your souls will be washed white in the blood of the Lamb. If you fail to be orderly servants, then you shall forever welter under intolerable blows and wounds from the devil, your overseer. In sum, Mather offered enslaved Africans two options: righteous assimilated whiteness and slavery to God and God's minions, or segregated criminal blackness and slavery to the devil and the devil's minions. Okay. So now, can we see why our people gave in? Why our people gave in and accepted this Bible? It is getting to America. Boston is in America. It's getting to America. But can you see how we ended up accepting that Bible? But we still knew. We just taking it. We're just taking it. We still gotta maintain our loyalty to us. Now, I forgot who I was listening to. It was an elder, and they said that that's what the elders, the ancestors, knew, that they still had to behind the scenes stay focused on Black people's liberation. And they did for a long time. But it was somewhere along the way, our elders, big mamas and great grandmamas and stuff, and them right there, I guess they didn't know that, hey, we just got to go along with this right here. We still got to keep that focus and that loyalty, that faithfulness to ourselves and our people. Because somewhere along the way, somebody dropped that crucialness right there about us, that crucial focus. They dropped it and didn't pick it back up. And now we have it where religion is just got your mind, your heart, your soul. It's got you. We can't even think past it. Ooh. I want to find a book to tell me how they got out of them caves. Who brought them out? Mather's writings on slavery spread throughout the colonies, influencing slavers from Boston to Virginia. By the 18th century, he had published more books than any other American, and his native Boston had become colonial America's booming intellectual center. Boston was now in the periphery of a booming slave society centered in the Tidewater region of Maryland, Virginia, and northeastern Carolina. The Mid-Atlantic's moderate climate, fertile land, and waterways for transportation were ideal for the raising of tobacco, and lots of it too. Fulfilling the voracious European demand, tobacco exports from this region skyrocketed from 20,000 pounds in 1619 to 38 million pounds in 1700. The imports of captives and racist ideas soared with tobacco exports. In the 1680s, enslaved Africans eclipsed white servants as the principal labor force. In 1680s, enslaved Africans eclipsed white servants as the principal labor force. In 1698, the Crown ended the Royal African Company's monopoly and opened up the slave trade. Purchasing enslaved Africans became the investment craze. The economic craze did not yield a religious craze, though. Planters still shied away from converting enslaved Africans, ignoring Mather's arguments. One lady inquired, "Is it possible that any of my slaves should go to heaven, and I must see them there? And must I see them there?" Christian knowledge, one planter complained, would be a means to make the slave more apt to wickedness. Cotton Mather's counterpart in Virginia, Scottish minister James Blair, tried to induce planters to realize the submission wrought by Christianity. The 1689 appointment of the 33-year-old Blair as commissary of Virginia, the highest ranking religious leader, reflected King William and Queen Mary's new interest in the empire's most populous colony. Blair used profits from slave labor to found the College of William and Mary in 1693, the colony's second college. In 1699, Blair presented to the Virginia House of Burgesses a proposition for encouraging the Christian education of Indians Negroes, and mulatto children. Lawmakers responded, rather inaccurately, that the Negroes born in this country are generally baptized and brought up in the Christian religion. As for imported Africans, lawmakers announced the gross bestiality and rudeness of their manners, the variety and strangeness of their languages, and the weakness and shallowness of their minds render it in a manner impossible to make any progress in their conversion. For the much more difficult commercial task, planters overcame the strange languages and had no problem teaching these shallow-minded, rude beasts in other matters. Planters of impossibilities suddenly became planters of possibilities when instructed imported Africans on the complexities of pro-slavery theory, racist ideas, tobacco production, skilled trades, domestic work, and plantation management. As Maryland's commissary, the Oxford-educated Thomas Gray did not fare much better than Blair in converting blacks during his tour of Maryland in 1700. Returning to London distressed in 1701, he organized the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts, the SPG. That's the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts. King William approved it, and an all-star cast of ministers signed up to become founding members of the Church of England's first systematic effort to spread its views to the colonies. Cotton Mather did not sign up for SPC, distrustful of Anglicans on every level. Even though Mather started mocking the Society for the Molestation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts, it was the Society for Propagation of the Gospel, but he started mocking it, calling it the Society for the molestation of the gospel. He remained in solidarity with Anglican SPG missionaries and Quaker missionaries in trying to persuade resistant enslavers to Christianize resistant Africans. Persuading planters was extremely difficult, though. Then again, persuading them to Christianize their captives was much easier than what Mather's friend tried to persuade them to do in 1700. Ooh. Oh, baby, we're on chapter 6. Boy. Yep. I think we're going to make it. Great Awakening. The new century brought on the first major public debate over slavery in colonial America. New England businessman John Saffin, Saffin, refused to free his black indentured servant named Adam after Adam served his contracted term of 7 years. When Boston Judge Samuel Sewall learned of Saffin's decision essentially to enslave Adam for the foreseeable future, Sewall was livid. Well known as one of the first Salem witch trial judges to publicly apologize, Sewall courageously took another public stand when he released The Selling of Joseph on June the 24th, 1700. Originally and naturally, there's no such thing as slavery, Sewall wrote. He shot down popular pro-slavery justifications such as curse theory, the notion that the good end in Christianity justified the evil means of slavery, and John Locke's just war theory. Sewall rejected those pro-slavery theories from the quicksand of another kind of racism. New Englanders should rid themselves of slavery and African people, Sewall maintained. African people seldom use their freedom well, he said. They can never live with us and grow up into orderly families. Samuel Sewall could not be easily cast aside like those powerless Germantown petitioners. A close friend of Cotton Mather, Sewall had received an audience with the king in England, and he had served as judge on the highest court in Boston. He was on track to becoming the Puritans' Chief Justice in 1717. When Sewall judged slavery to be bad, he should have opened the minds of many. But Pro-slavery racism had almost always been a closed-minded affair. In place of open minds, closed-minded frowns and hard words bombarded the 46-year-old jury. John Safin, in particular, was maddened by Sewall's attack on his business dealings. A judge himself, Safin refused to disqualify himself for adjuring a free case for Adam. At 75 years old in 1701, his lifetime in the trenches of early American capitalism had nurtured his outlook on powerful people, honey. Friendship and munificence. Yeah, friendship and munificence are strangers in this world, Safin once opened. That's Munificence. 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 Interest and profit are the principles by which all are swayed. No one attacked Safin, called him man-stealer, and got away with it. Before the end of 1701, John Safin had printed a brief and candid answer to a late printed sheet entitled The Selling of Joseph. God has set different orders and degrees of men in the world, Safin declared. No matter what Sewall said, it was not an evil thing to bring Africans out of their own heathenish country and convert them. Safin, well known among literary historians as a leading 17th century poet, ended his pamphlet in verse with, "The Negro's character. Cowardly and cruel are those blacks in it, prone to revenge, imp of inveterate hate." Samuel Sewall won the battle. Adam was freed in 1703 after a long and bitter trial, but he lost the war. America did not rid herself of slavery or of black people. In the newspaper debate that trailed the Sewall-Safin dispute, Bostonians seemingly found Safin's segregationist ideas more persuasive than Sewall's. Sewall did get in the last volley in his Lost War, prompted by the London Athenian Society questioning whether the slave trade was contrary to the great law of Christianity. Sewall answered affirmatively in a 14-page pamphlet in 1705. He pointed out that the so-called just wars between Africans were actually instigated by European slave traders, drumming up demand for captives. Meanwhile, the enslaved population continued to rise noticeably, which led to fears of revolts, and then, in 1705, new racist codes to prevent revolts, and to secure human property up and down the Atlantic coast. Massachusetts authorities forbade interracial relationships. They began taxing imported captives, and over Samuel Sewall's objections, they raided Indians and Negroes with horses and with hogs during the revision of the tax code. Virginia lawmakers made slave patrols compulsory for non-slave holding white people. These groups of white citizens were charged with policing slaves, enforcing discipline, and guarding routes of escape. The Virginia legislature also denied black people the ability to hold office, evoking repeatedly the term Christian white servant and defining their rights. Virginia lawmakers fully married whiteness and Christianity, uniting rich white enslavers and the non-slave holding white poor people. To seal the unity and racial loyalty, Virginia's white lawmakers seized and sold all property owned by any slave. The property thereof applied to the use of the poor of the said parish. The story would be told many times in American history. Black property, legally or illegally seized, the resulting black destitution blamed on black inferiority, the past discrimination ignored when the blame was assigned. Virginia's 1705 code mandated that planters provide freed white servants with 50 acres of land. The resulting white prosperity was then attributed to white superiority. Yep. Yeah, the asses ain't shit. You ain't a goddamn thing. From then to now, it's just like how they did Manifest Destiny. Always creating some bullshit. Always creating manipulation, murder, theft, and then justify it. Justify it morally, biblically, spiritually, intellectually. Then they want to justify it. Mm-mm-mm. Yeah, so they took, yeah. And then they got the nerve today to think that they really owed something. That's why I say, yeah, and I still stand by everything from at least 100 years back. Give it the fuck back. Give it back. Everything. I'm tempted to say everything 50 years back. I just call judgment. I call judgment on everything. On March the 1st, 1706, Cotton Mather asked God whether, if he wrote an essay about the Christianity of our Negro and other slaves, God would bless him with good service. Mather hoped the pamphlet focusing exclusively on this topic would help to shift the minds of enslavers who refused to baptize their captives. By now, he was unquestionably America's foremost minister and intellectual, having just published his New England History, a toast of American exceptionalism. Magnalia Christi Americana. Americana. That's Magnalia, not Magnolia. Magnalia Christi Americana, regarded as the greatest literary achievement of New England's first century. Mather released The Negro Christianized in June 1706. The providence of God sent Africans into slavery and over to Christian America to have the capacity to learn from their masters the glorious gospel. They are men and not beasts, Mather stressed, opposing segregationists. Indeed, their stupidity is a discouragement. It may seem unto as little purpose to teach as to wash Africans, but the greater their stupidity, the greater must be our application. That's what he proclaimed. Don't worry about baptism leading to freedom. The law of Christianity allows slavery. That's what he resolved. That's what he said. Don't worry about baptism leading to freedom. Because see, white folks was afraid once they baptized their slaves, then just like Elizabeth Key did, the slave would be able to petition for his freedom because Elizabeth Key won hers. So this was him telling white people, indeed, their stupidity is a discouragement. It may seem unto as little purpose to teach as to wash Africans, but the greater their stupidity, the greater must be our application, he proclaimed. Don't worry about baptism leading to freedom. The law of Christianity allows slavery, he resolved. He cited the writings of other Puritan theologians as well as St. Paul. On December 13, 1706, Mather believed wholeheartedly that God had rewarded him for writing The Negro Christianized. Members of Mather's church, without any application of mind to them for such a thing, spent 40 or 50 pounds on a very likely slave. He happily noted in his diary, New England churches routinely gifted captives to ministers. Mather named it Onesimus. Onesimus. That's one Simus. Onesimus. Onesimus. I would say one Simus, but I'd rather just say one Nesimus. After St. Paul's adopted son, a converted runaway. Mather kept a close racist eye on Onesimus, constantly suspecting him of thievery. Mather's Christian slavery views are more representative in New England than Samuel Sewall's or John Saffon's ideas. But Samuel Sewall's views continue to echo in the writings of others, In 1706, John Campbell's first full-fledged essay in his Boston newsletter, the second newspaper in colonial America, urged the importation of more white servants to reduce the colony's dependence on enslaved Africans who were much addicted to stealing, lying, and purloining. Americans reading early colonial newspapers learned two recurring lessons about Black people. They could be bought like cattle, and they were dangerous criminals like those witches. From their arrival around 1619, African people had illegally resisted legal slavery. From their arrival around 1619, African people had illegally resisted legal slavery. Thus, they had thus been stamped from the beginning as criminals. In all of the 50 suspected or actual slave revolts reported in the newspapers during the American colonial era, resistant Africans were nearly always cast as violent criminals, not people reacting to enslavers' regular brutality or pressing for the most basic human desire, freedom. It was as they were just criminals, always cast as violent criminals. As the sun flared up on the sky on April 7, 1712, about 30 enslaved Africans and 2 Native Americans set fire to a New York building, ambushing the Christians who came to put it out, as the story was told. 9 Christians were slain, 5 or 6 seriously wounded. The freedom fighters ran off into the nearby woods. Fear and revenge smoldered through the city. Within 24 hours, 6 of the rebels had committed suicide, believing they would return to Africa in death. The rest were hunted out by the soldiers and publicly executed, mostly burned alive. New York Colonel Governor Robert Hunter, who supervised the hunt, the trials, and the executions, was a member of Thomas Bray's Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts and the Royal Society. He framed the slave revolt as a barbarous attempt of some of their slaves. No matter what African people did, they were barbaric beasts or brutalized like beasts. If they did not clamor for freedom, then their obedience showed that they were naturally beasts of burden. If they nonviolently resisted enslavement, they were brutalized. If they killed for their freedom, they were barbaric murderers. Their barbarism occasioned a severe slave code, resembling the laws passed by the Virginians and the Puritans in 1705. New York lawyers stripped free Black people of the right to own property, and then they denigrated the few Negroes of the colony as an idle, slothful people who weighed on the public charge. In the midst of relentless African resistance and increasingly vocal anti-slavery Quakers, British slave traders were doing quite well, and they were primed for growth. In 1713, England won the Asiento, Asiento, the privilege of supplying captives to all of those Spanish American colonies, allowing it to soon become the 18th century's greatest slave trader, following in the footsteps of France, Holland, and the pioneers in Portugal. New England had become the main entryway into the colonies for European and Caribbean goods. Ships setting out from the colonies, mostly from Boston and Newport, Rhode Island, carried the food that fed the British Caribbean planters, the overseers, and the laborers. Ships returned hauling sugar, rum, captives, and molasses, all of them supplying New England's largest manufacturing industry before the American Revolution: liquor. Boston's status as one of the key ports in the colonies left the city vulnerable to disease. On April 21st, 1721, the HMS Seahorse sailed into Boston Harbor from Barbados. A month later, Cotton Mather logged in his journal: "The grievous calamity of the smallpox has now entered the town. 1,000 Bostonians, nearly 10% of the town, fled to the countryside to escape the judgment of the Almighty. 15 years prior, Mather had asked Onesimus one of the standard questions that Boston slaveholders asked new house slaves. Have you had smallpox? Yes and no, Onesimus answered. He explained how in Africa, before his enslavement, a tiny amount of pus from a smallpox victim had been scraped into his skin with a thorn, following a practice hundreds of years old that resulted in building up healthy recipients' immunities to the disease. This form of inoculation, a precursor to modern vaccination, and I heard about that 2 years ago, that was the first inoculation. Yep, they would make a little cut and put it off in there, whatever the illness was, and that way, just a little bit, and that way the body would form the defense mechanism to fight that off. This form of inoculation was an innovative practice that prevented untold numbers of deaths in West Africa and on disease-ridden slave ships to ports throughout the Atlantic. Racist European scientists at first refused to recognize that African physicians could have made such advances. Indeed, it would take several decades and many more deaths before British physician Edward Jenner, the so-called father of immunology, validated inoculation. Cotton Mather, however, became an early believer when he read an essay on inoculation in the Royal Society's Philosophical Transactions in 1714. He then interviewed Africans around Boston to be sure, shared their inoculation stories. He gave them a window into the intellectual culture of West Africa. He had trouble grasping it, though. Instead, complaining about how brokenly and blunderingly, and like idiots, they tell the story. On June the 6th, 1721, Mather calmly composed an address to the physicians of Boston, respectfully requesting that they consider inoculation. If anybody had the credibility to suggest something so new in a time of peril, it was Cotton Mather, the first American-born fellow in London's Royal Society, which was still headed by Isaac Newton. Mather had released 15 to 20 books and pamphlets a year since the 1690s, and he was nearing his mammoth career total of 388, probably more than the rest of his entire generation of New England ministers, everybody combined. The only doctor who responded to Mather was Zabadiel Boylston. Zabadiel Boylston, President John Adams' great uncle. When Boylston announced his successful inoculation of his 6-year-old son and 2 enslaved Africans on July 15, 1721, area doctors and councilmen were horrified. It made no sense that people should inject themselves with the disease to save themselves from the disease. Boston's only holder of a medical degree, a physician pressing to maintain his professional legitimacy, fanned the city's flames of fear. Dr. William Douglas concocted a conspiracy theory, saying there was a grand plot afoot among African people who had agreed to kill their masters by convincing them to be inoculated. There is not a race of men on earth more false liars than Africans. Douglas Barton. There's not a race of men on earth more false liars than Africans. Anti-inoculators like Dr. Douglas found a friendly medium in one of the colony's first independent newspapers, the New England Courant, Courant, launched by 24-year-old James Franklin in 1721. James Franklin's 15-year-old indentured servant and younger brother Ben worked as the typesetter for the newspaper. Feeling disrespected by the Courant, Cotton Mather demanded intellectual obedience like a tired college professor. The general public ignored him and withdrew. Boston's distaste for Mather and Boylston improved only when the epidemic that killed 842 people finally ended in early 1722. As April 1722 approached, Ben Franklin decided he wanted to do more than setting type for his brother's newspaper. He started anonymously penning letters with fascinating social advice, slipping them under the print shop door for his brother to print in the Quran. Signing the letters, Silence Do Good. Ben was inspired by Mather's 1710 Bonifacius, or Essays to Do Good, on maintaining social order through benevolence. The book gave me such a turn of thinking as to have an influence on my conduct through life, Benjamin Franklin later explained to Mather's son. After publishing 16 popular letters, Ben revealed the true identity of Silas Dogood to his jealous and overbearing brother. James promptly censored Ben. By 1723, all the ambitious Ben could think about was running away. Before fleeing to Philadelphia, Ben was summoned to a home on Ship Street. He nervously knocked on the door. A servant appeared and led him to the study. Ben entered and beheld probably the largest library in North America. Cotton Mather forgave Ben for the war on words, as a father would a misbehaving child. No one knows what else the 60-year-old and the 17-year-old discussed. Ben Franklin may have noticed Cotton Mather's melancholy. Mather's beloved father, then 84, was ill. When Increase Mather died in his oldest son's arms on August the 23rd, 1723, the tragedy toppled off some weary years for Cotton Mather, who had weathered marital disputes, financial problems, disagreements with Anglican ministers, being passed over twice for the Harvard presidency, and the news that Isaac Newton's Royal Society would no longer publish his work. Despite all of his successes, Mather began to worry about his intellectual legacy. If Mather stayed abreast of current events in the colonies in the 1720s, then he had no reason to worry about his missionary legacy. More fervently than any American voice since the 1680s, Mather had urged slaveholders to baptize enslaved Africans and enslaved Africans to leave the religions of their ancestors. Yep. So Cotton Mather, he urged the slaveholders to baptize enslaved Africans, and he urged enslaved Africans to leave the religions or the spiritualities of their ancestors. Moving slowly and carefully uphill, he had made strides over the years. Like-minded Anglican missionaries, such as James Blair, Thomas Bray, and the agents of his Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts, had taken this idea further, whether he realized it or not, and whether he despised the Anglican missionaries or not. Mather's prayers finally began to be answered during his final years. Edmund Gibson, the distinguished Anglican Bishop of London, decided to eliminate any lingering doubt in planters as to whether they could hold Christian captives. In two letters to Virginians in 1727, he praised and authenticated the innovative statute of 1667 that denied freedom to baptize captives. Gibson talked about how conversion obligated captives to the greatest diligencies and fidelity, an idea that Mather had been stressing for years now. The British Crown and the aides of Sir Robert Walpole, Walpole, the first Prime Minister of Great Britain, echoed the vision. All of Britain's religious, political, and economic power now united to free missionaries and planters from having to free the converted, thus reinvigorating proselytizing movements and dooming calls for manumission. More and more enslavers began to listen to the arguments of missionaries that Christian submission could supplement their violence in subduing the African people. Actually, the ministers focused on the submission and were mum on the violence. Yeah. Minister Hugh Jones, a William and Mary professor, published his highly influential Present State of Virginia in 1724. Christianity, Jones wrote, encourages and orders African people to become more humble and better servants. They should not learn to read and write, though. They were, by nature, cut out for hard labor and fatigue. In his stunningly popular 1722 collection of sermons, James Blair proclaimed that the Golden Rule did not suggest equality between superiors and inferiors. Order required hierarchy. Hierarchy required responsibility. Masters, Blair preached, were to baptize and treat their slaves kindly. Enslavers continued to become more open to these ideas right up until the First Great Awakening, which swept through the colonies in 1730s, spearheaded by Connecticut native Jonathan Edwards. His father, Timothy Edwards, had studied under Increase Mather at Harvard, and he knew and venerated Cotton Mather. During Edwards' junior year at Hale in 1718, Cotton Mather had secured the donation from Welsh merchant Elihu Yale, Elihu, Yale, Yale, that had resulted in the name of America's third college, the collegiate school, being changed. So the collegiate school was changed to Yale University. Rivals at Edwards, Massachusetts Church in Northampton jump-started the First Great Awakening around 1733. And awakening souls, passionate evangelicals like Edwards spoke about human equality in soul and the capability of everyone for conversion. I am God's servant as they are mine, and much more inferior to God than my servant is to me. The slaveholding Edwards explained in 1741. But the pro-slavery Great Awakening did not extend to the South Carolina plantation of Hugh Bryan, who was awakened into anti-slavery thought. Bryan proclaimed sundry enthusiastic prophecies of the destruction of Charlestown and deliverance of the Negroes from servitude in 1740. Honey, they thought they were doing something with these long motherfucking ass titles and shit, trying to make they motherfucking ass seem like they worthy and intellectual and moral. Motherfuckers ain't shit. Oh, wait. I'm just saying, damn. Bryan proclaimed sundry enthusiastic prophecies of the destruction of Charlestown and deliverance of the Negroes from servitude in 1740. His praying captives stopped laboring. One woman was overheard singing a spiritual at the water's edge, like so many other unidentified anti-racist, anti-slavery Christian women and men who started singing in those years. South Carolina authorities reprimanded Bryan. They wanted evangelists preaching a racist Christianity for submission, not an anti-racist Christianity for liberation. Hugh Bryan was an exception in the missionary days of the First Great Awakening, days Cotton Mather would not live to see. Though bedridden, he was happy he lived to see his 65th birthday on February 13, 1728. The next morning, Mather called his church's new pastor, Joshua Gee, into the room for prayer. Mather felt a release. Now I have nothing more to do here, Mather told Gee. Hours later, Cotton Mather was dead. He was perhaps the principal ornament of this country and the greatest scholar that was ever bred in it, praised the New England Weekly Journal on February 19, 1728, the day of Mather's burial. It was an accurate eulogy for the grandson of John Cotton and Richard Mather. Cotton Mather had indeed overtaken the names of his grandfathers, two ministerial giants bred into an intellectual world, debating whether Africa's heat or Ham's curse had produced the ugly ape-like African beasts who were benefiting from slavery, from enslavement. Ooh, ooh. Two ministerial giants bred in an intellectual world debating whether Africa's heat or Ham's curse had produced the ugly ape-like African beasts who were benefiting from enslavement. If his grandfathers consumed in England the racist idea of the African who can and should be enslaved, then Cotton Mather led the way in producing the racist idea of Christianity, simultaneously subduing and uplifting the enslaved African. He joined with the producers of racist ideas in other colonial empires from the mother countries in Europe and normalized and rationalized the expansion of colonialism and slavery. Europeans were taking over and subduing the Western world, establishing their rightful ruling place as the very standard of human greatness. Their racist producers proclaimed in a nutshell. By the time of Mather's death in 1728, Royal Society fellows had fully constructed this white ruling standard for humanity: Christianity, rationality, civilization, wealth, goodness, souls, beauty, light, Adam, Jesus, God, and freedom had all been framed as the dominion of white people from Europe. Yep. The only question was whether lowly African people had the capacity of rising up and reaching the standard. As America's first great assimilationist, Cotton Mather preached that African people could become white in their souls. In 1729, Samuel Mather completed his esteeming biography of his deceased father, as Cotton Mather had done for his father, and as Increase Mather had done for Richard Mather. When he walked the streets, Samuel wrote of Cotton Mather, he still blessed many persons who never knew it with secret wishes. He blessed the black man, dearly praying, Lord, wash that poor soul, make him white by the washing of the Spirit. We on part 2, honey. Part 2. Let me see what chapter this is. Thomas Jefferson. And is it going to tell us about Sabbath? Chapter 7, Enlightenment. All right, let's do it. Let's read. Nothing fazed him. He carried tired mules. He pressed on while companions fainted. He cut down predators as calmly as he rested in trees at night. Peter Jefferson had a job to do in 1747. He was surveying land never before seen by white settlers in order to continue the boundary line between Virginia and North Carolina across the dangerous Blue Ridge Mountains. He had been commissioned to certify that colonial America's westernmost point had not become like Jamaica's Blue Mountains, a haven for runaways. In time, though, Peter Jefferson's mesmerizing stamina, his strength, and courage on surveying trips became transfixed in family lore. Among the first to hear the stories was 4-year-old Thomas, overjoyed when his father finally came home at the end of 1747. Thomas was Peter's oldest son, born on April 13th during the memorable year of 1743. Cotton Mather's missionary counterpart in Virginia, James Blair, died 16 days after Thomas's birth, marking the end of an era when theologians almost completely dominated the racial discourse in America. The year also marked the birth of a new intellectual era. Enlightened thinkers started secularizing and expanding the racist discourse throughout the colonies, tutoring future anti-slavery, anti-abolitionists, and anti-royal revolutionaries. Enlightened thinkers started secularizing and expanding the racist discourse throughout the colonies, tutoring future anti-slavery, anti-abolitionists, and anti-royal revolutionaries in Thomas Jefferson's generation. And Cotton Mather's greatest secular disciple led the way. The first drudgery of settling new colonies is now pretty well over, Benjamin Franklin observed in 1743. And there are many in every province, and there are many in every province and circumstances that set them at ease. and afford leisure to cultivate the finer arts and improve the common stock of knowledge. At 37 years old, Franklin's circumstances certainly set him at ease. Since fleeing Boston, he had built an empire of stores, almanacs, and newspapers in Philadelphia. For men like him, who leisure about as their capital literary or figuratively worked for them, for men like him, who leisured about as their capital literally, who leisured about as their capital literally or figuratively worked for them, his observations about living at ease were no doubt true. Franklin founded the American Philosophical Society, the APS, in 1743 in Philadelphia. Modeled after the Royal Society, the APS became the colony's first formal association of scholars since the Mather's Boston Society in the 1680s. Franklin's scholarly baby died in infancy, but it was revived in 1767 with a commitment to all philosophical experiments that let light into the nature of things. The scientific revolution of the 1600s had given way to a greater intellectual movement in the 1700s. Secular knowledge and notions of the propensity for universal human progress had long been distrusted in Christian Europe. That changed with the dawn of a new age that came to be known as les Lumières, les Lumières in France. That's LES, all lowercase, capital Lumières, Lumières, les Lumières in France. Ooh, we Aufklärung in Germany, Aufklärung. Aufklärung, I think the F is silent. Aufklärung in Germany, Illuminismo in Italy, Illuminismo, like illuminescent. Well, it's Illuminismo, and the Enlightenment in Great Britain and America. For Enlightenment intellectuals, the metaphor of light typically had a double meaning. Europeans have rediscovered learning after 1,000 years in religious darkness. Europeans had rediscovered learning after 1,000 years in religious darkness, and their bright continental beacon of insight existed in the midst of a dark world not yet touched by light. Light then became a metaphor for Europeanness and therefore whiteness, a notion that Benjamin Franklin and his philosophical society eagerly embraced and imported to the colonies. White colonists, Franklin alleged in Observations Concerning the Increase of Mankind, 1751. Who the fuck told these folks they were smart? They was intelligent. White colonists, Franklin alleged in Observations Concerning the Increase of Mankind, 1751, were making this side of our globe reflect a brighter light. Let us bar uneconomical slavery and black people, Franklin suggested. Let us bar, that's what it said, let us bar uneconomical slavery and black people. But perhaps, he thought, I am partial to the complexion of my country, for such kind of partiality is neutral to mankind. Enlightenment ideas gave legitimacy to this long-held racist partiality, the connection between lightness and whiteness and reason, on the one hand, and between darkness and blackness and ignorance on the other hand. These Enlightenment counterpoints arose conveniently at a time when Western Europe's triangular transatlantic trade was flourishing. Great Britain, France, and the colonial America principally furnished ships and manufactured goods. The ships sailed to West Africa, and traders exchanged these goods at a profit for human merchandise. Manufactured cloth became the most sought after item in 18th century Africa for the same reason that cloth was coveted in Europe. Nearly everyone in Africa, as in Europe, wore clothes, and nearly everyone in Africa, as in Europe, desired better clothes. Only the poorest of African people did not wear an upper garment, but this small number became representative in the European mind. It was the irony of the age. Slave traders knew that cloth was the most desired commodity in both places. But at the same time, some of them were producing the racist idea that Africans walked around naked like animals. Producers of this racist idea had to know their tales were false. Producers of this racist idea had to know their tales were false. And then when you think about in slavery, the babies, the kids didn't get clothes till they were like 10. And then that was just that potato sack. You know, that cloth sack, that burlap sack. Then it was just one of them put on. With no shoes, no socks, no underclothes or nothing, just a sack. But they went on producing them anyway to justify their lucrative commerce in human beings. The slave ships traveled from Africa to the Americas, where dealers exchanged at another profit the newly enslaved Africans for raw materials that had been produced by the long enslaved Africans. The ships and traders returned home and began the process anew, providing a triple stimulus for European commerce and a triple exploitation of African people. Practically all of the coastal manufacturing and trading towns in the Western world developed an enriching connection to the transatlantic slave trade during the 18th century. Profits exploded with the growth and prosperity of the slave trade in Britain's principal port, Richard Mather's old preaching ground, Liverpool. The principal American slave trading port was Newport, Rhode Island, and the proceeds produced mammoth fortunes that can be seen in the mansions still dotting the town's historical waterfront. Wasn't Liverpool in the movie Amistad? I want to say. In his 1745 book, endorsing the slave trade and Royal African Company, famous economics writer Malachi Postlethwaite, Postlethwaite, Postlethwayt. Yeah, Postlethwaite. We'll just say Postlethwaite. Defined the British Empire as a magnificent superstructure of American commerce and naval power on an African foundation. But another foundation lay beneath that foundation, those all-important producers of racist ideas who ensured that this magnificent superstructure would continue to seem normal to potential resistors. Enlightenment intellectuals produced a racial idea that the growing socioeconomic inequities between England and Senegambia, Europe and Africa, the slavers and the enslaved, had to be God's or nature's or nurture's will. Racist ideas clouded the discrimination, rationalized the racial disparities, defined the enslaved as opposed to the enslavers as the problem people. Anti-racist ideas hardly made the dictionary of racial thought during the Enlightenment. Carl Linnaeus, Linnaeus, the progenitor of Sweden's Enlightenment, followed in the footsteps of Francois Bernier and took the lead, classifying humanity into a racial hierarchy for the new intellectual and commercial age. In Systema Naturae, first published in 1735, Linnaeus placed humans at the pinnacle of the animal kingdom. He sliced the genus Homo into Homo sapiens, humans, and Homo troglodytes. That's 8. And so on. And further divide the single Homo sapiens species into 4 varieties. At the pinnacle of his human kingdom reigned H. sapiens europaeus. Very smart, inventive. Talking about white folks. Very smart, inventive, covered by tight clothing, ruled by law. Then came H. sapiens americanus, ruled by custom, and H. sapiens asiaticus, ruled by opinion. He relegated humanity's nadir, N-A-D-I-R, H. sapiens A-F-E-R, to the bottom, calling this group sluggish, lazy, crafty, slow, careless, covered by grease, ruled by caprice, C-A-P-R-I-C-E, describing in particular the females with genital flap and elongated breasts. Carl Linnaeus created a hierarchy within the animal kingdom and a hierarchy within the human kingdom. And this human hierarchy was based on race. His enlightened peers were also creating human hierarchies within the European kingdom. They placed Irish people, Jews, Romani, and Southern and Eastern Europeans at the bottom. Enslavers and slave traders were creating similar ethnic hierarchies within the African kingdom. Enslaved Africans in North America were coming mainly from 7 cultural geopolitical regions. Angola, 26%, Senegambia, 20%, Nigeria, 17%, Sierra Leone, 11%, Ghana, 11%, Ivory Coast, 6%, and Benin, 3%. Since the hierarchies were usually based on which ancestral groups were thought to make the best slaves or whose ways most resembled of those of the Europeans, different enslavers with different needs and different cultures had different hierarchies. Generally, Anglocans and Glolans were classed as the most inferior Africans, since they were priced so cheaply in slave markets. That's due to their greater supply. Linnaeus classed the Khoi, or the Hottentot of South Africa as a divergent branch of humanity. Homo monstrosis monarchidae. Since the late 17th century, the Khoi people have been deemed the missing link between human and ape species. I was going to say that's the one. Remember, we was reading in the other reading a couple of readings ago about the phrases we be saying like mumbo jumbo, and I was thinking that it was the Hottentot, but it was another group that the colonizers couldn't understand their language, so they always said that it's just mumbo jumbo. Oh, it's just mumbo jumbo. It's just nonsense. It don't make any sense. It's not even words being put together because they couldn't understand it. Making hierarchies of Black ethnic groups within the African kingdom can be termed ethnic racism because it is at the intersection of ethnocentric and racist ideas, while making hierarchies pitting all Europeans all over Africans as simply racism. In the end, both classified a Black ethnic group as inferior. Standards of measurement for the ethnic groups within the African hierarchies were based on European cultural values and traits. And hierarchy making was wielded in the service of a political project, enslavement. Senegambians were deemed superior to Angolans because they supposedly made better slaves, and because supposedly their ways were closer to European ways. Imported Africans in the Americas no doubt recognized the hierarchy of African peoples as quickly as imported white servants recognized the broader racial hierarchy. When and if Senegambians cast themselves as superior to Angolans to justify any relative privileges they received, Senegambians were espousing ethnically racist ideas, just like those white people who use racist ideas to justify their white privileges. Whenever a Black person or group used white people as a standard of measurement and cast another Black person or Black group as inferior, it was another instance of racism. Carl Linnaeus and Company crafted one massive hierarchy of races and of ethnic groups within the races. The entire ladder and all of its steps, from the Greeks or the Brits at the very top down to the Angloans and the Hottentots at the bottom. Everything bespoke ethnic racism. Some superior Africans agreed with the collection of ethnocentric steps for Africans, but they rejected the racist ladder that deemed them inferior to white people. They smacked the racist chicken and enjoyed its racist eggs. Every traded African ethnic group was like a product, and slave traders seemed to be valuing and devaluing these ethnic products based on the laws of supply and demand. Linnaeus did not seem to be a part of this grandiose scheme to force feed ethnic racism to enslaved peoples to divide and conquer them. But whenever ethnic racism did set the natural allies on American plantations apart in the manner that racism set the natural allies in American poverty apart, enslavers hardly minded. They were usually willing to deploy any tool, intellectual or otherwise, to suppress slave resistance and ensure returns on their investments. Voltaire, France's Enlightenment guru, used Linnaeus' racist ladder in the book of editions that supplemented his 500,000-word essay on universal history. Yes, he used Linnaeus' racist ladder in the book of editions that supplemented his 500,000-word essay on universal history in 1756. He agreed there was a permanent natural order of the species. He asked, were the flowers, fruits, trees, and animals with which nature covers the face of the earth planted by her at first only in one spot in order that they might be spread over the rest of the world? No, he boldly declared. The Negro race is a species of men as different from ours as the breed of Spaniards is from that of greyhound. If their understanding is not of a different nature from ours, it is at least greatly inferior. The African people were like animals, he added, merely living to satisfy bodily wants. However, as a warlike, hardy, and cruel people, they were superior soldiers. With the publication of Essay on Universal History, Voltaire became the first prominent writer in almost a century daring enough to suggest polygenesis. The theory of separately created races was a contrast to the assimilationist ideas of monogenesis, that is, of all humans as descendants of a white Adam and a white Eve. Voltaire emerged as the 18th century's chief arbiter of segregationist thought, promoting the idea that the races were fundamentally separate, that the separation was immutable, and that the inferior black race had no capability to assimilate, to be normal, or to be civilized and white. The Enlightenment shift to secular thought had thus opened the door to the production of more segregationist ideas. And segregationist ideas of permanent black inferiority appealed to enslavers because they boasted their defense of the permanent enslavement of black people. Voltaire was intellectually at odds with naturalist George Louis Leclerc, who adopted the name Buffon. Buffon headed the moderate mainstream of the French Enlightenment through his encyclopedic Histoire Naturelle, Natural History, which appeared in 45 volumes over 55 years, beginning in 1749. Nearly every European intellectual read them. And while Voltaire promoted segregationist thinking, Buffon remained committed to assimilationist ideas. The argument over Voltaire's multiple human species versus Buffon's single human species was one aspect of a larger scientific design during the Enlightenment era. Their beloved Sir Isaac Newton, he envisioned the natural world as an assembled machine running on natural laws. Newton did not explain how it was assembled. I believe there was a black man that he learned from, Newton. But I digress. That was fine for Voltaire because Newton did not explain how it was assembled, possibly because he didn't know the young black uh, the young black man, student, slave, didn't tell him how it was explained. He may have shown him, but he didn't break it down to him. If this happened, if that happened, you know. That was fine for Voltaire, who believed the natural world, including the races, to be unchangeable, even from God's power. Buffon instead beheld an ever-changing world. Buffon and Voltaire did agree on one thing. They both opposed slavery. Actually, most of the leading Enlightenment intellectuals were producers of racist ideals and abolitionist thought. Buffon defined a species as a constant succession of similar individuals that can reproduce together. And since different races could reproduce together, they must be of the same species, he argued. Buffon was responding to some of the first segregationist denigrations of biracial people. Polygenetics were questioning or rejecting the reproductive capability of biracial people in order to substantiate their arguments for racial groups being separate species. If blacks and whites were separate species, then their offspring would be infertile. And so the word mulatto, which came from mule, came into being because mules were the infertile offsprings of horses and donkeys. In the 18th century, the adage, black as the devil, battled for popularity in English-speaking world with God made the white man, the devil made the mulatto. Buffon distinguished 6 races or varieties of a single human species, and the Khoi people of South Africa he placed with monkeys. He positioned Africans between the extremes of barbarism and of civilization. They had little knowledge of the arts and sciences, and their language was without rules, said Buffon. As a climate theorist and monogeneticist, Buffon did not believe these qualities were fixed in stone. If Africans were imported to Europe, then their color would gradually change and become perhaps as white as the natives of Europe. It was in Europe where we behold the human form in its greatest perfection, and where we ought to form our ideas of the real and natural color of man. Buffon sounded like the foundational thinker of modern European art history, Johann Joachim Winkelmann, Winkelmann of Germany. Yeah, Johann Joachim Winkelmann of Germany. A beautiful body will be all the more beautiful the whiter it is, Winkelmann said in his disciplinary, in his in his disciplinary, disciplinary. Winkelmann said in his disciplinary classic, "Uwe des Geschwich der Kunst des Atherisms, History of the Art of Antiquity," in 1764. These were the Enlightenment ideas on race that Benjamin Franklin's American Philosophical Society and a young Thomas Jefferson were consuming and importing to America on the eve of the American Revolution. Woo. I taught my oldest grandson how to say his name in German because his father is part German. That was some years ago and stuff. But yeah, when I was reading that right there, I could see him learning to say it and stuff. And he did. He learned how to say it. That was some years ago. He was much younger then. But I think since then he like, nah, nah, nah. I don't know. Peter Jefferson acquired around 1,200 acres in Virginia's Albemarle County and went on to represent the House in the House of Burgesses, Virginia's legislative body. Shadwell, his tobacco plantation sat about 5 miles east of the current center of Charlottesville. The Jefferson home was a popular rest stop for nearby Cherokees and Catawbas on their regular diplomatic journeys to Williamsburg. The young Thomas Jefferson acquired impressions of detachment, acquired impressions of attachment and commiseration commiseration for them, which had never been obliterated. He reminisced years later. While Thomas was raised on the common sight of distinguished Native American visitors, he commonly saw African people as house workers, tending to his every need, as well as field workers tending to tobacco. In 1745, someone brought a 2-year-old Thomas Jefferson out of Shadwell's big house. Thomas was held up to a woman on horseback, who placed him on a pillow secured to the horse. The rider, who was a slave, took the boy for a ride to a relative's plantation. This was Thomas Jefferson's early childhood memory. It associated slavery with comfort. The slave was entrusted with looking after him, and on his soft saddle, he felt safe and secure, later recalling the woman as kind and gentle. When he played with African boys years later, Thomas learned more about slaveholding. As he recalled, the parent storms, the child looks on, catches the lineaments of wrath, puts on the same airs in the circle of smaller slaves, give a loose to his worst passions, and thus nursed, educated, and daily exercised in tyranny, cannot but be stamped by it with odious peculiarities. In his home, no one around him saw anything wrong with the tyranny. Slavery was as customary as prisons are today. Few could imagine an ordered world without them. Peter Jefferson had accumulated almost 60 slaves by the 1750s, which made him the second largest slaveholder in Albemarle County. Peter preached to his children the importance of self-reliance, oblivious to the contradiction to which he credited his own success. Peter did not, however, preach to his son the importance of religion. In fact, when Virginia's first Great Awakening reached the area, it bypassed the Shadwell plantation. Peter didn't even allow Samuel Davies, who almost single-handedly brought the awakening to Virginia, to minister to his children or his captives. It is likely that Peter believed, like many of his slaveholding peers, that Christianizing the Negroes makes them proud and saucy, and it tempts them to imagine themselves upon an equality with the white people. As Davies reported in his most celebrated sermon in 1757, some American planters had been sold on Davies' viewpoint that some should be masters and some should be servants, and more were open to converting their captains than ever before, but not enough of them to satisfy Cotton Mather's like-minded missionaries, who agreed with Davies that a good Christian will always be a good servant. Enslavers commonly let slaves live on in their pagan darkness. Fearing Christianity would incite their resistance, observed a visiting Swede, Peter Kalm, in the late 1740s. 20 years later, irritable Virginia planter Landon Carter fumed about blacks being devils, adding, to make them otherwise than slaves would be to set devils free. Not all Christian missionaries were protecting slavery by preaching Christian submission in the mid-18th century. In 1742, New Jersey native John Woolman, a store clerk, was asked to write a bill of sale for an unnamed African woman. He began to question the institution and soon kicked off what became a legendary traveling ministry, spreading Quakerism and anti-slavery. After his first Quaker mission in the harrowing slaveholding South in 1746, Woolman jotted down some considerations on the keeping of Negroes. We are in a high station and enjoy greater favors than they, William theorized. God had endowed white Christians with distinguished gifts. By sanctioning slavery, America was misusing his gifts. Woolman planted his groundbreaking abolitionist tree in the same racist soil that pro-slavery theologians like Cotton Mather, preaching divine slavery, had used a century ago. Their divergences over slavery itself obscured their parallel political racism that denied Black people self-determination. Mather's pro-slavery theological treatise proclaimed masters divinely charged to care for the degraded race of natural servants. Woman's anti-slavery treatise proclaimed Christians to be divinely charged with greater favors to emancipate, Christianize, and to care for the degraded slaves. But whether they were to be given eternal slavery, but whether they were to be given eternal slavery or eventual emancipation, enslaved Africans would be acted upon as dependent children reliant on white enslavers or abolitionists for their faith. So, yeah. Yeah, eternal slavery. John Woolman bided his time before submitting his essay to the press of the Philadelphia Yearly Meeting. Woolman knew the history of Quakers quarreling over slavery, of abolitionists disrupting meetings and being banished. He cared just as much about his Quaker ministry and Quaker unity as he did anti-slavery. In 1752, when abolitionist Anthony Benezet was elected to the press's editorial board, Woolman knew the time was right to publish his 8-year-old essay. By early 1754, Benjamin Franklin's Pennsylvania Gazette was advertising a new publication of Some Considerations on the Keeping of Negroes. By the end of the year, though, some Quakers had started to move like never before against slavery, pushed by Benezet and Woolman and the contradictions of Christian slavery. Benezet had edited Woolman's essay. If Woolman thrived in privacy, Benezet thrived in public, and the two reformers made a dynamic duo on anti-slavery activists. In 1754, the Philadelphia Yearly Meeting approved for publication the Epistle of Caution and Advice concerning the buying and keeping of slaves. In the epistle, anti-slavery reformers struck a compromise, urging Quakers to buy no more slaves. The writers evoked the Golden Law on the 66th uncelebrated anniversary of the Germantown Petition. Benezet initiated the writing of the epistle and incorporated input from Woolman. Hundreds of copies were shipped to the quarterly meetings in the Delaware Valley. The front door of American Quakerism had officially been opened to anti-slavery, but Quaker masters quickly slammed the doors to their separate rooms. 70% refused to free their captives. Woolman learned firsthand of their dogged refusal when he ventured into Maryland, Virginia, and North Carolina in 1757 and found they ass with all them slaves. Slavery's defenders spewed many racist ideals, ranging from blacks being a backward people to them living better in America than in Africa, to the curse of Ham. It troubled Woolman to perceive the darkness of their imagination. He never faltered in shooting back in his calm, compassionate way. No one is inferior in God's eyes, he stressed. They had not imported Africans for their own good, as demonstrated by their constant abuse, constant overwork, constant starvation, and constant scarce clothing. In 1760, Woolman traveled to the Rhode Island homes of some of the colonial America's wealthiest slave traders. Their smooth conduct and superficial friendship nearly lured him away from anti-slavery. He ventured back home to New Jersey as he had done from the South years earlier, dragging a heavy bag of thoughts. In arguing against slavery over the years, he found himself arguing against African inferiority and thus arguing against himself. He had to rethink whether white people were in fact bestowed a high station. In 1762, he updated Considerations on Keeping Negroes. We must speak out against slavery from a love of equity, Woolman avowed in the second part of the pamphlet. He dropped the rhetoric of greater favors in a racial sense, although it remained in a religious sense. His anti-racism shined, placing on men the ignominious title slave, dressing them in uncomely garments, keeping them to servile labor, tends gradually to fix a nation in the mind that they are a sort of people below us in nature, stated Woolman. But whites should not connect slavery with the black color and liberty with the white, because where false ideas are twisted into our minds, it is with difficulty we get fair disentangled. In matters of right and equity, the color of a man avails nothing. Woolman's anti-racism was ahead of his time, like his passionate sermons against poverty, anti-cruelty, military conscription, and war. But Woolman's anti-slavery in the 1750s and 1760s was right on time for the American Revolution, a political upheaval that forced freedom fighters of Thomas Jefferson's generation to address their relationships with slavery. Dr. Thomas Walker's remedies did not work, and when his patient, the 49-year-old father of Thomas Jefferson, died on August the 17th, 1757, it was an unbelievable sight for all who had heard the family lore of Peter Jefferson's strength. The 14-year-old Thomas had to run his own life. As the oldest male, he now headed the household, according to Virginia's patriarchal creed. But by all accounts, the 37-year-old Jane Randolph Jefferson did not look to her 14-year-old son for guidance, or to Dr. Walker, the estate's overseer. She became the manager of 8 children, 66 enslaved people, and at least 2,750 acres. Jane Jefferson was sociable, fond of luxury, and meticulous about keeping the plantation's records, traits she bestowed upon Thomas. In 1760, Thomas Jefferson enrolled in the College of William and Mary, where he thoroughly immersed himself in Enlightenment thought, including its anti-slavery ideals. He studied under the newly hired 26-year-old Enlightenment intellectual William Small of Scotland, who taught that reason, not religion, should command human affairs, a lesson that would inform Jefferson's views about government. Jefferson also read Buffon's natural history, and he studied Francis Bacon, John Locke, and Isaac Newton, a trio he later called the 3 greatest men the world has ever produced. When Jefferson graduated in 1762, he entered the informal law school of Virginia's leading lawyer, George Wythe, W-Y-T-H-E, well known for his legal mind and taste for luxury. Admitted to the bar at 24 years old in 1767, Jefferson stepped into the political whirlwind of the House of Burgesses, representing Albemarle County just like his father had. The Burgesses protested England's latest imposition on taxes, prompting Virginia's royal governor to close their doors on May 17, 1769. Jefferson had been seated all of 10 days. Even after he lost the seat, Jefferson actively participated in the growing hostilities to England and to slavery. He took the freedom suit of 27-year-old fugitive Samuel Howell. Virginia law prescribed 30 years of servitude for first-generation biracial children of free parents to prevent that abdominal mixture of white men or women with Negroes and mulattoes. Howell was second generation, and Jefferson told the court that it was wicked to extend slavery because under the law of nature, all men are born free. Wythe, the opposing attorney, stood up to start his rejoinder. The judge ordered Wythe back down and ruled against Jefferson. The law in the colonies was still staunchly pro-slavery, and racial laws were becoming staunchly segregationist. But then suddenly, a Boston panel of judges reversed the ideological trend. Oh, yes. I want to turn the page. I think we're on chapter 8. I believe we made it. Yes, we made it to chapter 8, honey, and we're going to do it tomorrow. We're going to start it tomorrow. Black exhibits. Black exhibits. Oh, where these people? Oh, there go Wheatley. I see Phyllis Wheatley name. Phyllis Wheatley, the poet making her case before Samuel Mather and other Bostonians, is now remembered as the first in the line of illustrious African American writers. And we got one of Phyllis's books. We got one of Phyllis's books right over there with her poems and stuff in it. And I did read some of them, but I didn't understand it at first. As you know, Phyllis was very brilliant, but this was her way of condemning slavery in her writings and stuff. And once I realized that, I learned it somewhere, heard it somewhere and stuff, that was her way of condemning slavery and what we went through, what Black people went through. Then it made her readings more better for me to, to get into them and to digest them and stuff. Because some of this reading and stuff, it's just like, it's foreign. It is so foreign. But thank you. We made it to chapter 8. I thank y'all so much. I just thank you. I really do. I love y'all. To have the interest, woo, yeah, it's deep. To have the interest, it's my hair. It ain't his. It's my piece of hair that fell off in my water, but that's all right. It's my hair shit. But yeah, I'm just so proud of y'all, and I love y'all so much. I really do. Y'all are awesome. Ooh, I can't wait till we just really start growing together and stuff, and we really get to knowing each other and how we thinking and what's resonating with us and stuff, on a more familial level. Because we are family, and all of this right here, all of these readings and stuff, it ties us together. We are reflection. That's how I think of y'all, as a part of me, and I want us all to be together, to all be safe in life and in the afterlife. I don't want us to be divided anymore. All of these things that these people have put against us ever since they learned, to stay out of them caves and stuff. I don't know where all of that ties into it and stuff. I just know they came after us. And when they did and they came out of them caves and started walking upright and stuff, everything went downhill. It's a mess. I wish we could start it all over again. Sure could, honey. But I love y'all. I love you so much. And I thank you. And let's process this too. I'm finna process this. I wish I could do some homework, but I'm sleepy. I'm probably going to process and go to sleep. And I'll see y'all tomorrow on the next reading. Because we on chapter 7 about politics and powernomics. And that's where I wanted to get to. And I'm going to call Sister Joanne. If I feel the notion to, I will call her because I got her number written down somewhere. Dr. Claus' wife. I think I still got her number written down somewhere. And I will find it and call her again and ask her, where do I go from here? And where is, can you give me some connections? And I can just go ahead and get connected with them already. But, on its own time and stuff. Peace and power to the people, family.